Greetings and welcome back to the Wild Swans at Coole. Today we are discussing John Dryden's Flecknoe as a personal satire, or does it fulfill the criteria of mock epic? First, gets a quick idea of what this poem is about. Flecknoe is a mock heroic satire written by Dryden. In this poem, Dryden is basically making fun of another writer called Thomas Shadwell by calling him the king of dullness. The whole poem shows Flecknoe, an old foolish poet, choosing Shadwell as his successor to rule over a kingdom of nonsense. Now, the funny part is, this whole event is described like a grand royal coronation, but the subject itself is completely silly, and that is where the humor comes from. Now, let's understand the main idea. This poem is called a mock heroic or mock epic poem. What does that mean? It means Dryden is using the style of a serious epic like kings, empire, coronations, but instead of talking about something heroic, he is talking about something trivial and ridiculous. So basically, big style but small subject. That contrast is the key. So the whole poem shows Flecknoe, an old foolish poet, choosing Shadwell as his successor to rule over a kingdom of nonsense. Now, the funny part is, this whole event is described like a grand royal coronation, but the subject itself is completely silly, which is choosing Shadwell as a successor to rule over kingdom of nonsense. That means basically mocking Shadwell. In real epics, you have great heroes and noble actions, but here Dryden takes a dull writer and treats him like a great king. That mismatch creates irony and makes the whole thing funny. Right from the beginning of the poem, we see this technique. Flecknoe is compared to Augustus Caesar, who was a great Roman emperor, but Flecknoe is actually a useless poet. So when Dryden compares him to someone so great, it sounds like praise, but it's actually mockery. This is what we call epic inflation, using exaggerated grand language for something unimportant. Then Flecknoe is presented as a king who rules over an empire. However, this empire is not real. It is the realm of nonsense. Words like empire, prince, throne, and reign are usually associated with greatness and authority. Here they are used ironically to describe a kingdom of stupidity. But what kind of empire? Not a real one. It's the realm of nonsense. Again, high language for a low subject. Now let's talk about the personal satire. The poem is also a personal satire because it directly attacks Shadwell. This poem is not just general. It directly attacks Shadwell. Dryden shows him as someone who has no intelligence, no creativity, no wit. In fact, he is shown as the perfect person to inherit the throne of dullness. So the satire is very direct and personal. This direct criticism of a particular individual makes the satire more sharp and effective. One of the important techniques used by Dryden is ironic politeness. Dryden often uses polite and praising words, but he actually means the opposite. For example, when he calls Shadwell fit or worthy, these words are usually sarcastically. The reader understands that Dryden is not truly admiring Shadwell, but is instead exposing his weakness. This makes the satire more subtle and powerful. Now, one of the most interesting parts of this poem is the coronation scene. Flecknoe decides to crown Shadwell as the king of dullness, and the whole ceremony is described like a grand royal event. But when you look closely, everything is ridiculous. The place where the coronation happens, it's dirty, is not a place, low area filled with uncultured people. Instead of royal decorations, there are torn books and bad writings. These books belong to inferior poets, including Shadwell himself. So instead of glory, we see failure and stupidity. Dryden also uses funny comparisons to insult Shadwell. For example, he compares him to Arion, a great musician whose music attracted dolphins. But Shadwell can only attract small fishes. This clearly shows how low his talent is compared to real artists. There are also references like historical figures like Hannibal. Hannibal has shown lifelong hatred against Rome. In a similar way, Shadwell is shown as someone who has devoted himself to dullness and has avoided intelligence all his life. It's obviously exaggerated, but that is what makes it funny. This comparison is clearly absurd, but it emphasizes Shadwell's lack of wit in a comic way. Then we have Flecknoe's speech. At first it sounds serious, like a king giving wise advice, but the advice is actually ridiculous. Shadwell is told to remain ignorant and continue being dull. So again, serious tone, foolish content, that contrast creates humor. He is told to continue being dull. This contrast between the serious tone and ridiculous advice creates humor and reinforces the satirical purpose of the poem. Dryden also criticizes Shadwell's literary works. He refers to his plays such as The Virtuoso and compares him unfavorably to great writers like Ben Jonson. He mentions Ben Jonson's plays and compares him, but instead of praising him, he shows how inferior Shadwell is. He suggests that Shadwell does not need to work hard because he has no real talent anyway. Another thing to notice is the poem includes imaginative fantasy. The whole idea of kingdom of dullness and its coronation is fictional and exaggerated. This makes the poem more creative. It also helps to highlight the absurdity of the situations. This makes the poem more creative and entertaining while still delivering strong satire. Finally, in the ending, Flecknoe falls and his mental descends upon Shadwell. This is similar to epic traditions where power is passed from one hero to another. However, in this case, what is transferred is not greatness but dullness. This ending maintains the mock heroic tone and completes the satire. What that means? This is something we usually see in epic poems, where power is transferred from one hero to another. But here, what is being passed on is not greatness but dullness. So the mock heroic tone continues till the very end. The comic effect of the poem is one of the most important features. The use of exaggerated language, absurd situations, ironic tone makes the poem more humorous. At the same time, the poem delivers a strong criticism of Thomas Shadwell. In conclusion, Flecknoe is an example of personal satire written in mock heroic style. It combines the grandeur of epic poetry with a trivial subject to create humor and irony. Dryden uses various techniques such as exaggerations, ironic politeness, and imaginative fantasy to ridicule Shadwell. The poem successfully exposes the weakness of this target while entertaining the reader. It remains one of the finest examples of mock epic poetry in English literature. So overall, what do we understand? That Flecknoe is a perfect example of mock heroic satire. Dryden uses grand epic style to describe a completely trivial subject. The contrast between high language and low subject is what makes the poem so effective and memorable. So if we want to remember in just one line, it's the big style plus small subject is equal to mock epic, and you will understand the whole poem. So if you have liked this video, please make sure to like, subscribe and share with your friends.